This is the Eco front rack. In your box, you should find 1 top plate, 2 support arms, and 4 clamps. You also have a bag of hardware in which you'll find 4 M6 screws, 6 M5 screws, and washers and nuts for each of those, along with 4 spacers. To assemble our front rack, we're going to attach our top plate to the support arms. And the front of our rack is this part that's angled. And the front of our top plate is the curved part here. So we're going to align the 3 assembly holes along the top plate with the matching holes in the support arm. We're going to put our bolts through from the top and our M5 washers and nuts from the bottom. I'm going to put all 3 along one side and get those started, and then I'll do the other side, and then I'll use my hand tools to tighten everything down. All right, that's one side started. You want to make sure that the smooth side is out. You can do this backwards and that won't work. Now the same thing on the other side. Okay, we've got all 6 sets of hardware started. So now we're going to grab our hand tools and tighten everything up. The hand tools you'll need to finish the assembly are a 3mm hex key. I'm going to be using a 3mm hex socket adapter, and you'll also need an 8mm wrench or an 8mm socket. Once we get this assembled and we're ready to put it on the bike, you'll also need a 4mm hex key, and that's to tighten the clamps. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the hardware on this. All right, that's one side tight. Now on to the other side. Okay, that's step 1 complete. We've got our support arms attached securely to our top plate. Double check that all the hardware is snug and you didn't forget one, and then we can move on to the next step. For step 2, we're going to disassemble our clamps. And that can be done with a 4mm hex key and removing each of the 2 bolts on either side of the clamp. There's a lock washer on each of these bolts, and we want to make sure that it stays on there. Don't lose the lock washer. You can set the back half of the clamp aside for now. We'll need that when we install it on the bike. Now we've got our clamps disassembled. I'll set the back half aside for now, and the hardware to assemble those, we won't need that until we're putting it on the bike. Step 2 is to get our clamps loosely attached to our front rack assembly and ready to go on the bike. We're going to need our flange head M6 bolts, our spacer bushing, and the M6 lock nuts and a washer. We're going to place the flange head bolt through the large hole in the clamp. Then we're going to place a spacer bushing on top of that. Place that through the hole in the front rack. Place a washer and a lock nut. We're just going to do those finger tight for now. We're going to put the M6 bolt through the large hole in the clamp. Put a spacer bushing on top of that. Place that through the appropriate hole in the rack with a washer and an M6 nut on there. We're going to grab another clamp, grab the M6 bolt, make sure that it's oriented correctly, place it through the large hole in the clamp, put a spacer bushing over the bolt, place that through the hole in the rack, and we're going to use a single washer and an M6 lock nut. I'm just putting these on finger tight for now. That's one side done. We'll continue exactly the same on the other side. Bolt, clamp, spacer, washer, nut. Okay, now that we've got those started, we're gonna grab our tools and snug them down. We don't want them tight enough where they can't move, but we do want them snug where they'll hold in a position. So for that, we'll need our M4 hex key and a 10mm wrench. Okay, to continue step 2, we want to tighten our clamps onto the rack in a way that they're snug enough to hold a position, but not so tight where they won't move. We want them to be able to move a little bit so we can align them on the bike. To do that, we'll use a 4mm hex key and a 10mm wrench. Shouldn't take much, and this will hold a position. We'll go a little bit tighter than that. Now I can still move this by hand, but it'll hold in its position. And this will let us get it aligned perfectly on the bike when we're ready. Check it. Same thing on this side. We're just gonna tighten these enough so that they hold in position. That's good. And that's good. So this is our Eco front rack, fully assembled and ready to be installed on the bike. Okay, now we're at our bike, we're ready to install our Eco front rack. And to do that, we've got to move a few things around to make room for the clamps and to move our headlight to the orientation that it's going to stay in underneath the rack. So to start, we're going to loosen our clamps on our headlight bracket. We're going to slide the bracket up. We'll then remove the headlight and mount it upside down from its current orientation. Then we'll move our bumpers into the correct place, and that's going to give us the precise location and space to mount our clamps for our front rack. So I'll start with the headlight bracket first. To move the headlight bracket, we're gonna need a 3mm Allen or hex key and an 8mm wrench for the nut on the inside. We don't have to remove this all the way. We're just gonna loosen it to allow the possibility of moving this bracket up against the steering bumpers. Just gonna loosen that and check it to see if this wants to move. Not yet. Okay, that should be loose enough. Same thing on the other side. Okay, that feels loose enough. Set our tools down and attempt to move the headlight up against the bumpers. And we'll just do a little on each side at a time. You can remove this all the way. You might find that easier. We're just gonna try to slide it. Okay, our headlight bracket is pushed all the way up against the steering bumpers. You're gonna wanna spin those bumpers to make sure that the square portion is still gonna do its job at full lock and make contact with the frame. Just check both sides. That one's all the way up, that one's all the way up, and I'm gonna go ahead and snug those brackets back down. So using our 3mm hex and our 8mm wrench, we'll just snug the headlight bracket back down. You don't have to go too crazy tight on that. Once you feel it about wrist tight, it should be good. The next step is to remove this bolt, which mounts the headlight, and we're gonna flip it upside down and reinstall it. For that, we'll need a 10mm wrench and a 5mm hex. Got the nut off, so now we just need to press or pull the bolt out. I'm hanging onto the light, make sure that doesn't fall. So now we can pull our headlight out carefully, and we're gonna flip it over. Make sure you pay special attention to the wiring. We don't want that to twist. And we'll press it back in between the brackets, and we'll get our nut and our bolt back in place. Okay, I've got my headlight aligned with the bracket. I can put my bolt back in place. Okay, I've got my bolt pushed through for my headlight. I'm gonna make sure the wiring looks okay. We're gonna tuck this connector down behind the light and put our washer and our nut back on. And then we wanna position our light close to the head tube so that it's gonna aim in the correct direction. We don't want it aiming up like this. Once you've got it in the correct location, go ahead and snug this down, do any final adjustments to the position of the light, and tighten it all the way. So we've got our headlight back on the bike, upside down, and we can still move it, which is important in this step. We're gonna grab our front rack. We've rotated the top clamps up out of the way. If the rubber inserts fall out, just keep track of those. And what we're gonna do now is place this onto the fork stanchions with the lower clamps. And we want to be careful to miss this cable, which goes to the front motor. So we'll place that in place on that side and get the other one on this side. And you have to be pretty precise with your placement here. There's the bracket that holds the lock. Our clamp is going to be just above that, and it needs to be slightly above it to allow us to get the back half of the clamp on. So I'm going to do that on both sides. As you can see, I've got this resting on the tire, so it can be done with one person. So we'll start with this side. All right, so we've got a couple turns. I'm checking that, and now we're ready to do the other side. Okay, I've got the back half of my clamp. The rubber insert is in place, and again, we want to go as low as possible without interfering with that bracket on the lock. Double check that you're not pinching any wiring. So that's one side started. That's both our bottom clamps started. I'm not going to tighten those yet. Now, the reason we left the headlight loose enough to be able to move is that we're going to carefully rotate these clamps around it, which might require rotating the headlight slightly. Push these clamps back onto the fork tubes, again making sure that we're not hitting any wiring. To make sure that our rubber inserts haven't moved. Good on that side. And we'll repeat with the back half of the clamp, the rubber insert, get the screws started. Once we have all the clamps started, we can go around and tighten them snug. Continually check to make sure that wires are clear, the rubber inserts are in the correct place. I went ahead and unlocked that. That's gonna let me rotate the fork and just get a little more action out of my hex key here. That's that side done. Just double checking to make sure wiring looks good, nothing's pinched. Okay, so that's all of our clamps with the bolts started. We wanna rotate our headlight down and position that correctly. We'll go back and make sure we snug that headlight bolt so it holds our headlight in the correct position. Maybe if it's at nighttime, you wanna shine this at a wall or something and just check the direction that it's aimed at. Now it's time to just go around, tighten all the clamps snug. We don't wanna go too crazy on those. And you wanna make sure that you're doing this evenly. So constantly look at that gap. That is this gap here, and make sure that it's consistent from one side to the other side of the clamp. That looks pretty good. We end up with about an 1/8 inch or 3mm gap, and that's okay. The clamp's still doing its job. It doesn't have to close all the way. Again, about wrist tight is what I like to call it. Don't have to go crazy with it. Okay, that's all of our clamps tight. We do have a little bit of play in the holes in these clamps, and that's to allow us to adjust the rack slightly. So once we're happy with how that looks pretty good to me. We can tighten the hardware that connects the clamps to the rack, and that's with your 4mm hex and your 10mm wrench. And finally, we'll want to position our light and tighten this down. And that is your front eco rack.